want to just quickly recap the history of the money in the temple. That's what we're going to be focusing our show on today. This starts all the way back before the last millennium, when the Pharisees that were called out by Jesus, they had piggybacked an entire economy on people's faith. Now, the reason why this is so insidious and not what God wants, and why Jesus threw the money out of the temple, is because people begin to associate their faith and latch onto their faith the value of money. And you can't do that. That is not what God wants. He doesn't want money mixed in the temple, because faith is a very spiritual thing where basically you're in this heightened sense of love for God, and the enemy can try to hijack that and take advantage of it. And this is why there is no place for money in the temple. So, of course, then Jesus came along. He threw the money out of the temple. Remember, when you think about Jesus' life, he operated with virtually no assets or overhead, except for a grassy hill here and there, or a few fish that he used to feed a crowd. God doesn't need your money. He wants your love and your time. That's all that matters to him. So then we fast forward in this history of the money in the temple to the year 1913. I found this site here that talks a little bit about the history of how all this played out. And this is when the U.S. government officially recognized churches as tax exempt. Now, there's a little bit of prehistory before this in the late 1800s, where many church organizations, or let's say individual churches, they were not taxed. But then soon after that, it became official in 1913, where they recognized churches as tax exempt. But this is when they began to apply specific rules to what they could and couldn't do. And actually, they gave a rule as to what defines what a tax exempt church is. So as we follow the progression of the history of these churches, you're going to begin to understand that there was a long con, let's call it, a long multi-generational attempt to control churches. Now, in 1913, the government officially recognized churches as tax exempt, and they applied these specific rules. And I believe this was the foundation for what future churches would be required to look like. And it's very specific. Some of this language here in the 501c3 definition is some of the very same language from 1913. What constitutes a 501c3 church? And it's very specific. This is what they have to look like. And what you're going to notice is this is basically like a corporate structure that they applied. So no, in other words, let me simplify this. In order to get the tax exemption, this is what your church had to look like. So they defined what a church looks like. So right there, that's blasphemy. Only God gets to define what a church is. And all churches that get 501c3 tax exemption fall under this. So let's go through them. A distinct legal entity, a recognized creed and form of worship, a definite and distinct ecclesiastical government. It even says in here, a form of code of doctrine. Now, some of these cross over with early churches that Paul and disciples started. You know, some of these things seem to apply to this definition, but others do not. A form or code of doctrine, discipline, a distinct religious history, a membership not associated with any other church or denomination, complete organization of ordained ministers ministering to their congregations, ordained ministers selected after completed prescribed course of study. So was this something that God required, that you have to study and get some kind of a degree? Of course not. See, this is how they begin to control things. Literature of its own. So basically you have to have some kind of a print shop and print this literature up, okay? Again, that wasn't something required by the early church. Why is the government defining that here? Establish places of worship. Okay, so once again, Jesus was a carpenter. He never built a church. So why are they basically saying you have to have an established place of worship? See, all of this feeds back into them and their ability to control it. They can't control anything that doesn't have an address, right? Now you're starting to see how all this dovetails into a lot of the things that we've been talking about for a long time. How the Pharaoh needs your address. The headdress of the Sphinx, which includes the word address in it. Your post is marked, the postmark, the blood of the lamb on the post and lintel. He needs an address in order to control you. And so they basically made it so churches have to have a building, and they have to have a place of worship. Regular congregation, this is so they can keep things flowing, keep the indoctrination going. Regular religious services, Sunday schools. Now, why would they need Sunday schools for instructing the young? So the government basically is saying, okay, we're going to indoctrinate the young people too. Now, when I say indoctrination, I'm talking about what you're going to see me demonstrate to you of how the government has its claws in the churches, and how ultimately at the end of the day, churches that say they represent God actually are serving two masters. And when it all hits the fan, make no mistake, it's already starting to, and when I'll demonstrate that to you today, there will be deception coming straight from the church. These churches follow this corporate structure, and you're going to see why in a minute. And in effect, 1913 declawed churches with any substantial membership or influence, and they set the foundation for how the federal government would in the future control them. Now, some people would argue, well, that doesn't mean that money is back in the temple. Well, it kind of does, because there's money on the table, and it allows for the control and manipulation of the churches by government with the threat of pulling their tax exemption. So what you have is non-exempt churches watching exempt churches thrive and have a leg up. And what this does, it creates a temptation for non-exempt churches to join the crowd so they can keep more of their money. Now, the devil has all kinds of ways of trying to get pastors and church organizations to justify this, okay? I don't want you to think that these pastors and church organizations start out as being controlled and manipulated. That's not what I'm saying here. And I'm not saying these are bad people. What I'm saying is they've been tricked and deceived and fooled. So back then, most of these churches were small back in 1913, right? And they weren't very organized across the entire U.S., with the exception of mainly the Catholic Church. The 1800s was really when the Reformation kicked off and all these different denominations sprung out of Protestantism. I can't even say the word. And I believe that was all by design. So the Catholic Church was losing power, Protestants were gaining power, and the Catholic Church said, we need to co-opt this. It's going to happen anyway. We need to figure out a way to get control of it. So they splintered off all these denominations out of the Catholic Church. This is what I believe happened. You can read history for yourself and find out. And they just told everybody, oh, these are just people that started these churches. But what you'll notice is all these churches that started back then, they were from these family bloodlines. And they started these whole denominations that are still around today. Not many of them went bankrupt. Not many of them lost their power. It was almost like some kind of deal was made. We'll let you split off in all these denominations. We'll leave you alone. But really, you're still under our control. Now, as these churches began to organize and expand, the tax-exempt status became crucial to their survival. And this is about the time the feds decided to enhance their power grab with the Johnson Amendment of 1954. What was that about? Well, that specifically said that basically you can't do any kind of political activity whatsoever as a church organization. I'm looking through and trying to figure out when all this went down and why it went down. There must have been some threat that the federal government felt that these churches were that they had too much power and that they could actually originate a candidate on their own, run that candidate, and then all come together across all denominations and get that person elected to change things like termination, R.V. Wade. Right? And they couldn't let that happen because the whole entire foundation of this country is based off of human sacrifice. So that can never go away. Everyone talks about it going away, but it's never going to go away because this is what Satan wants. And unfortunately, we all live in a country where this happens. Now, of course, this happens in other countries, but we do a really good job of human sacrifice in this country on all fronts. So, Johnson Amendment happened, and lo and behold, very little power was allowed for these churches. So from 1954 to 2017, churches were completely and thoroughly controlled from ever being a game changer for God in America. And isn't that ironic? One nation under God, but a neutered church who can't organize to get anybody elected who could actually make a difference. And that brings us to now. and this is where these changes and updates happen. 2017, Trump signed an executive order to relax restrictions on what churches can and can't say from the pulpit and their political involvement in elections. And on the surface, this sounds like a great thing, but we're going to get into some of the specifics of this. Here's the executive order here. Here's Trump. This was in 2017, and everyone was so excited that they couldn't lose their tax exemption because of Trump's executive order. Something else happened that you probably weren't aware of. 2018, the following year, a Republican-controlled House passed a law to open the floodgates for churches to receive political money to support a candidate. And according to this 2018 bill, the IRS can no longer pull tax-exempt status for churches getting involved in elections unless it's specifically approved by the IRS commissioner, which just so happens to be a guy that Trump put in place. So now you're starting to see what's going on here. Let's read through this article a little bit. Here's the 2018 House law. Now, I didn't know this, so this is all new information to me. Let's read through this. House voted Thursday, this was 2018, to make it harder for the government to punish churches that get involved in politics. In a 217 to 199 vote. Now, this was the 115th Congress. If you want to look this up, the Republicans controlled the House. This is why they were able to get this to go through. They approved legislation barring the IRS from revoking tax-exempt status of churches that back political candidates unless it is specifically approved by the commissioner of the agency, commissioner of the IRS. The provision buried in a budget measure setting IRS funding for the upcoming year amounts to backdoor way around the so-called Johnson Amendment, half-century-old prohibition nonprofits getting involved in political campaign activities. Nonprofits denounced the measure and noted it came only days after the Treasury Department announced it was dropping requirements that most charitable organizations can disclose their big donors to the IRS. So we had a couple things going on with this. There was no more requirement to disclose big donors. We had that you could not lose the tax exempt status only through the commissioner of the agency, whereas before anyone could drop a complaint. Now it can only come from the commissioner. And then Trump put in his own IRS commissioner just to close off the loop. So now he's got complete control of being able to pour money into these churches with no recourse. Now this is crazy. Charles Rettig is the guy that Trump put in place. And of course, Charles Rettig, because of the executive order, he's not going to go after these 501c3s for accepting large amounts of money. Since I've stepped outside of the right-left paradigm, I see this for what it is. This is basically when the Republicans had control of the House, they basically made it so that Trump could get reelected by buying off churches. That's basically what happened here. Now, let's keep going with this because there's a lot more. Now, how will this go down with elections? Obviously, we have 2020 election coming up. Who are these churches going to vote for? Who's going to try to pour money into these churches? It's not going to be the left. The left isn't going to pour money into churches because they're opposed to churches. You're not going to see Biden going and trying to get the evangelical vote because he knows he would get destroyed. But you never know. Now that the floodgates are open, now that opens it up for Biden to try to pull the same thing, to start pouring money into churches so that they'll campaign for him. So all this sounds all great and everything, right? If you truly believe that Trump is under God, but it's not okay. Because what's happening here is the money has been brought right back into the temple. Now, what this does is it politicizes the trusted charitable nonprofit community. It authorizes unlimited, untraceable political money to flow right through the nonprofit sector to benefit partisan interests. And anybody who uses critical thinking will understand that that is the case. And if you think that pouring money into churches from corrupt governments is a good thing, then you haven't been reading your Bible. This is a manipulation tool, and it drags this corruption right back into the temple. And look, what's going to happen if or when the Dems get power? Because we know that things swing back and forth. You'll get a Republican president for 2 terms, and you'll get a Democrat. So when the Dems come back in, what are they going to do? They're going to appoint their own IRS commissioner who will go after the 501c3s. They'll undo the executive order, and we'll be right back to where we started, with the Dems now threatening, and there could be recourse. They could come after some of these churches who bought the bait to get Trump elected, right? Because the Johnson Amendment hasn't changed. It's still in place. That law hasn't changed. There's just a recommendation through the executive order, okay, and the change in only the commissioner being able to go after and revoke 501c3. So whoever this commissioner will be will make all the difference in the world as to what happens to churches. Some commissioner, a commissioner on the left, might try to go a hard line, enforce the Johnson Amendment. Other commissioner on the right won't, and then they'll do this the opposite. Republicans will pour money in these churches and get them to campaign for them, which is exactly what we're seeing happening. I want you to notice how Trump's move is designed to allow money into the churches, but it still ties the church's hands to originate their own candidate, to organize across denominations, and to get that person elected under God while keeping their tax-exempt status. In other words, the government never just leaves churches alone under God to do God's will. There's always a catch. It's only if you support the candidate they put forward. They're not going to let a church get a pastor elected, for instance. Now, Trump did soften the Johnson Amendment, but solely for his own benefit, so that he could pour money into these churches in preparation for the 2020 elections. Now, the Treasury Department, they did drop the requirements that most charitable organizations disclose their big donors to the IRS. So the rule is still in place, but it can only be enforced by the IRS controller. And Trump's executive order is only a recommendation, not a law. Here's where things get interesting. Let's take a look at this story, because here's a real example of a church that got money from the Trump campaign. He didn't give them money, but he leased their church, which obviously, let's all be honest here, since they don't have to disclose the amount that they leased the church to him for, they could have leased it to him for $1 million, $2 million, $5 million. You know, the little scratch on the back, they don't have to show that to the IRS. So this is how they get around this. This happened in 2020, and the writers of the article, I don't think they were aware of the law that the House passed in 2018 to basically neutralize the threat. But imagine a Democrat-controlled administration and what they would have done to this church. Now, I want you guys to understand how serious this is. So let's take a look here. Trump presidential campaign has held rallies at a variety of cities and venues. A lot of money going out from the Trump campaign to churches of any amount. We don't know the amount because it doesn't have to be reported anymore, right? He's basically buying off the churches. Many have provoked protests from those who oppose the president's positions, but the rally to be held this Friday at King Jesus International Ministry, a mega church in Miami, has prompted a call for the IRS to revoke the church's nonprofit status. And of course that can't happen because of the law that I just told you. A letter from the legal director of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, nonprofit that works on separation of religion, church, and state issues, calls on the IRS to promptly investigate the church. The grounds that they use is the Johnson Amendment, which states while church religious leaders may express their own opinions to individuals, they may not make partisan comments in official organization publications or at official functions of the organization. That would be called taking the claws out of a cat. That does not make God happy. So these people are going after this church, right? And it says here, King Jesus International Ministry states on its website that it is nonpartisan, non-political church that does not endorse candidates or engage in political campaigns. It does advocate on issues of concern to its ministry, though. The church claims it is being paid for the use of its site by the Trump election campaign. So this is proof right here that this is happening. This has never happened. This is unprecedented in the history of churches and state for a presidential candidate to pour money into a church and no one know what that amount was. It could have been any amount, and that leasing of space should not be seen as an endorsement of President Trump, but obviously it was used as an endorsement for President Trump. The church helped him campaign. So it's all smoke and mirrors. I want you guys to see that this is a very real example, and this is happening all over the place. Now, up to this point, the church had no real power under the threat of losing their exemption, and now Trump's given churches this false sense of security that the threat's been removed. Also that he can pour money back into the temple to control churches with large donations so that they'll lobby for him. Now it makes sense why all these churches are supporting Trump, because they're getting paid to do it. I went straight to the IRS website because I wanted to find out the Johnson Amendment that is still in place and what these rules are for these churches specifically. It says in here that these are key words. The organization's purposes and activities may not be illegal or violate fundamental public policy. Let me zoom in on that. What does that mean, Casey? Well, if something is lawful and you are going against what is lawful as a church, you could lose your status. So you're not allowed to, for instance, discriminate against any group, which is what they call discrimination, right? If you refuse service to someone because of their sexual orientation, their creed, their color, you could be found breaking the law, violating fundamental public policy. The church essentially becomes a government employee. You see where all this is headed? You see what happens if the Dems get power? They could start force feeding these churches, for instance, same-sex marriage, because it's public policy that's illegal. So you can't not do that. And this is the slippery slope, you see. And now on top of it, Dems get power, guess what's going to happen? They're going to put their own IRS guy in, and they're going to start pouring money into churches. And believe me, there will be churches with their hand out going, oh, you're going to give me $5 million to start doing same-sex marriages? All right. You see where all this is headed. This has everything to do with not speaking against things that are lawful, like ending of pregnancy, same-sex marriage, overseas conflicts. Is this of God? No, it's not. I think I demonstrated that pretty thoroughly today. Churches have grown dependent on these tax exemptions. Most churches can't even keep their doors open or maintain their assets and their infrastructure without this tax exemption. So this threat is looming over their head, always controlling the narrative about the things that are most important to God. It's all being dictated by the government sitting back there in the background. Human life, suffering, and harming of the innocent. And now with this huge influx of money, the churches will become puppets of whatever candidate claims to be a man of God. I think God's problem with this is when that money is used to control the church. See, the misconception about politics and religion is that religion is not supposed to get involved in politics, that they should give up their right to have political influence, and nothing could be further from the truth. If you just look into the Bible and read all the different stories of how God's chosen people almost every time influenced political leaders. Moses did it with Pharaoh. There were prophets under leaders that were influenced by those prophets because of God working through the prophet. That's all God's people did, was influence political leaders all throughout the Bible. The problem is when you add money. God doesn't need your money to have a church, and Jesus proved it with his life. I believe the whore of Babylon is here. These are the false churches. It's any church that takes us political money, takes the 501c3 tax exemption and the rules that come along with it. I believe we've arrived. And this will be the point at which people have to make a choice. Many people will believe the lie because, believe it or not, a lot of people go to church for themselves. I mean, if we're all honest, a lot of people just don't go to church for the right reasons. They go because it feels good, because they give their penance. They show up for a couple hours, somehow makes them feel better about their life and their walk with God. It really has nothing to do with, or not a lot to do with, what they're being taught. People like to be entertained. They like to hear great music. It's kind of for all the wrong reasons. And a lot of people switch churches over and over again for all the wrong reasons. And so this is what we're dealing with. And so therefore, this is a personal issue more often than not. This is because of our individual spiritual walk with God as to what this is about in these churches. The churches are just going to be churches. They're going to do what they do. What it comes down to is what's in your heart. I grew up Jehovah's Witness, but then I went away from that, and then I jumped from the frying pan into the fire with the Seventh-day Adventists. They have their own doctrines, and basically at the end of the day, I realized that those two religions were very, very, very similar in their format. It's that corporate structure we were talking about, right? Now I know why, because it's outlined in the 501c3 code. It actually tells you exactly what you can and can't do. And so what has happened is I've realized that, because we did shows like years ago, and I told you guys, it's so weird how these churches are set up. They're very, very similar. If you go from denomination to denomination, they're very similar in their format. You come in, there's a greeting, there's pews. All churches have pews or chairs. You come in, you're greeted. There's always like a greeter at the door. You take your seats, a song plays, the song is over, there's a prayer, then they open up typically with the business portion of the meeting. They talk about, the state of the religion or whatever, the denomination. They talk about what state it's in. And then what ends up happening, there's usually like another song or prayer, and then there's a sermon, and then there's another song, and then it's over. And somewhere in there, they'll drop in the collection plates, right? All these churches follow a very similar format. So you got to ask yourself, what's that really about? Well, those are some of the guidelines that are set out by the IRS themselves of what a church, the format that a church has to follow. Not that exact format, but they've learned that this is the format that works, so that when they're audited, everything can be presented in a certain and specific way. So we're at a turning point, and I anticipate that things are going to change, and they're going to change fast. We're not going to even recognize our churches anymore, and all of the sins are going to be brought into the church. This could be the abomination that causes desolation. This could be it. This could be the moment at which the temple is finally corrupted. Okay, when they try to drag this stuff into the church under the money coming into churches by the federal government. Make no mistake, there are pastors and church organizations that are wringing their hands right now going, finally, we can get some real money. All we got to do is stand behind this candidate. You see how this works? This is why you have to be very careful